So do you admit that the parole board got it wrong?
Well, that's a hindsight question.
No,
And
but hang on a minute, it's a question.
It is. The work done by in the report, which shows that it was a careful, considered decision, took into account all of the relevant information. We went on a step-by-step basis for parole, and so and it reached a conclusion that the decision was reasonable at the time it was made.
But that's not my question. Does the parole board admit that they got it wrong?
Well, that's my answer. That the report indicates or shows that
But
this was...
I'm not asking about the report. You're the chairman of the parole board. Do you admit that the parole board got it wrong?
I accept that the family believe we did get it wrong, and they're deeply upset and hurt by this.
But what do you think?
They see the tragic circumstances.
Well, they're living the tragic circumstances of a parole board decision.
My assessment has got to be undertaken as at the date when the parole board made its decision, because anything else is hindsight. And
but they clearly got it wrong.
The independent answer is in the report.
Well, let's have a talk about the report. I mean, what do you think of that report?
Well, I think it's a report completed by an independent person. We didn't want to do an internal assessment. I could have done it because, of course, I've had no involvement in it. I'm relatively recent to the job, but that seemed wrong.
Do you agree with its findings?
I do.
So
I do. It was a careful process, and if you read the decisions, which I know you have, from 2007, 8, 9, 10, they illustrate how careful it was, how the parole board indeed raised issues that corrections had never identified, psychologists had not identified.
One of the things that's said in this review, this independent review, is there are no clear lessons for the board to learn from this tragedy. I mean, surely you can't accept that yourself. I mean, that's
I think there are some lessons to learn. And perhaps I do differ from the conclusion there. The kind of things that I think are able to be learned are firstly the monitoring issue, which I've said. Perhaps we don't have enough time to check on people who are being released from prison for very serious crimes. The parole board's right to monitor in a direct sense had ended. We had no oversight at all because the law says we don't. We would like to have a wider monitoring right, and that's something I'm certainly going to take up with the government and suggest consideration is given to it by Parliament. I've gone to the Victim Symposium and talked about these kinds of issues. I've talked about them again with the Justice Advisory Group, and I'll want to be following this up after sentencing with corrections and police. We've all got to honestly examine what we did and with anything can be learned, because I mean, if there's a legacy for these two young women, it's that.
Okay, but you see, the family just say, look, the parole board have got blood on their hands, that they've cost another life, Nicole Tuxford, and indirectly the suicide of Mr. Schroeder as well. This was no ordinary, if there is such a thing, murder.
Well, I know and understand very much how upset and angry and that the families are. I've heard it personally from them, and I understand that, and I understand their point of view about what the parole board did and the circumstances.
Well, what the parole board didn't do would be their argument. So did he dupe you, do you think?
Well,
did he dupe all the psychologists?
There's no way of answering that. They did, as I've said, this was a lot of people, 4 different psychologists. The parole board's made up of people, judges, psychiatrists, ordinary people from the community. There were lots of people who were on that parole board, and these are people who are careful. We're very conscious this is a public safety job, but we live on the edge of risk.
And you got it wrong.
Well, the hindsight issue arises again.
I don't understand why you can't say you got it wrong. He went out
Well,
after he was released
it's
and
not a question
brutally murdered somebody again.
Sure. I understand the question, and I appreciate what you're saying. We released him, and he killed, and that's got to be accepted, and it is accepted. And the other thing to keep in mind is there was 7 years between the time he was released and the time he committed this offending. So there is a significant period of time during which we monitored, and the probation service, I'm sure, monitored.
Well, maybe not monitored enough.
Well, we've monitored to the extent we can.
So you monitored for that 1 year.
Correct, and that was it.
And then it goes to the probation.
Well, the probation service has it from the day of his release, because he is a probation officer, and probation officers have obligations in terms of contact with prisoners. But we can only see him for a year unless something goes wrong. If something goes wrong, police or corrections can apply to recall.
Was he allowed to drink?
He wasn't prohibited from drinking.
So something went wrong when he got pulled up by the police at a checkpoint the night before he murdered Nicole Tuxford. Here we have this man who was, in common terms, a lifer. He's got knives in his car. He's 3 times over the limit. So something went wrong then.
Well, that fell to the police to make a decision. Obviously, I don't have any knowledge about the facts and what happened in any detail, but the police do have the power to apply to the parole board to recall him to prison, and we respond within hours, sometimes less than an hour from receiving an application, and if we think it's justified, we sign an arrest warrant and he can immediately be taken into custody.
So him being 3 times over the limit with knives in his car, would that be an occasion that would have been warranted for the parole
Well, I'd need to know,
to do that?
as I've said, that you're asking me what the police knew, and I don't really know what the police knew. And so
Well, let's just talk then hypothetically. If we've got an offender like Paul Russell Wilson, let's not forget he tied up the flatmate, he tortured Kimmy Schroeder, cut all her hands, carried on for a couple of hours before he cut her throat. We've got this guy at a checkpoint, 3 times over the limit with knives in his car. Would that be a time that, had the police called you, that the parole board would have done something?
Sure. What I can say, and I think it's fair to say, is lawlessness by a lifer often results in recalls.
But
And
not on this occasion?
Well, because no application was made. Now, whether it should have been made or not, I can't say, because firstly, it's not my decision to apply, and secondly, I don't have all the facts. But what I will say is that, lawlessness, that is acting outside the law by a lifer, is typically, where that comes to the attention of the parole board, it is common to grant a recall.
And when you say a recall, for people that don't know, that means?
Bring them back to prison.
It's like that?
Like that.
And on an occasion like drinking and driving with knives in your car, in your opinion, you're also a former judge, would that be one of those occasions? Well,
I think I've answered it by saying that lawlessness is highly relevant to making a decision about a recall.
Okay.
But it's got to be, and someone's got to tell us. Someone's got to tell the parole board.
Because the superintendent of the Christchurch Police, I just want to give you the quote, "Our staff did not and could not predict his intentions when he'd left the checkpoint that night. There is no certainty that anything could have made a difference to this tragic outcome, given the circumstances involving that night." It's pretty hard to swallow for Nicole Tuxford's mother, Cherie.
I understand the way Cherie feels about these issues.
So is there some sort of systemic failure going on here?
Well, that implies that there is a case to be made for all of this, and we don't know yet. So so I'm not. That's why I'm not responding, or in the sense that I'm not saying or commenting on what the police have done. But what I will do, and what I've already pledged to the families, that I will leave no stone unturned in working through what's happened to see if improvements can be made.